we're going to talk to Daniel Haqiqatjou. Daniel, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Kim. Glad to be here.
Sorry, I mispronounced your last name, and can you say it for us all so we know?
Sure, it's Haqiqatjou. Haqiqatjou. So one of the letters is specific to Arabic and Persian, so it's difficult for non-Persian or Arabic speakers to pronounce it. But you did a great job.
I don't think it was a great job, but it was a job. All right, Daniel, I want to get into, first of all, tell us what type of Islam do you practice?
I'm a Sunni Muslim. I was born into a Shia family, most Iranians. That's my ethnic background, Iranian American. I was born in the U.S., but my parents immigrated. And so that's where my name comes from, actually. And I was Shia, but then in high school, I did more research and I became Sunni.
What made you switch from Shia to Sunni?
Well, it's based on my research. Sunni Islam is more authentic to the practice of the Prophet, peace be upon him, Prophet Muhammad. And so it's a epistemological question. Do the rituals and practices and specific beliefs of Shia or Sunni, which are more authentic to the life of the final messenger, Muhammad, peace be upon him? So that's what Muslims, whether Shia or Sunni, pride themselves on, is that all of humanity from the beginning has been sent prophets. Many of the prophets mentioned in the Bible, for example, Abraham, Moses, Noah, David, Solomon, etc., all the way to Jesus Christ, which we also believe in and believe he's the Messiah, born of virgin birth. And then the final prophet, the final messenger is Muhammad, peace be upon him. But the issue is, and the way that Islam teaches this, is that prophets have to keep coming because people corrupt the teachings that God has revealed. So we believe in one God, God Almighty, without any other gods, without any partners. And he is a transcendent Lord and creator. And he has sent guidance and revelation and books of revelation to people. And then over time, over the eons of human civilization, these get corrupted by people because of politics or because of people's desires or satanic influence. And then so God continues to send prophets to correct those mistakes. And the final prophet, the final messenger, is Muhammad, peace be upon him. And so it's very important to maintain and preserve the authenticity because he's the final prophet. There's not going to be other prophets until the end of days, the end of time. And therefore, authenticity is very critical. So my investigation of Shiism is that they're not authentic in some of their beliefs and practices. They're still Muslim. Majority of Sunnis believe, or Sunni scholars believe, that Shia are still Muslim. But that's the kind of investigation and analysis I did when I was in high school and then college, and I became Sunni.
Is your family still Shia?
Yes, I think they consider themselves still Shia for the most part, but they're also a little bit more secular. I had more of a secular upbringing. Not that we didn't believe in God. We believe in God. We believe in Islam. But in terms of being like going to the mosque every single day or every single week, that wasn't really part of my childhood. I came into it because of the influence of friends that I happened to meet in high school.
So your family was secular, but then you made friends who were also Muslim, but they were Sunni Muslim.
Yes. And at first, I, kept my Shia identity. I was a proud Shia. And I thought, look, I'm going to prove these Sunnis wrong. I'm going to show them the error of their ways. But then, the tables got turned.
Okay. So now how, I don't know how to ask this question, but how extreme, because I don't know if you would, when you ask somebody, how extreme are you? Do you think you're extreme? But on a scale of 1 to 10, how extreme are you? If you could even answer that honestly, if a person could make that sort of self-assessment.
Yeah, maybe a better word is orthodox.
Okay.
Like how orthodox or how traditional, how traditional or authentic am I practicing Islam? And I consider, my practice and my belief to be 100% authentic. As for like me, myself, I'm just a average Muslim, and Muslims, they strive to, get rid of their sins and to be better worshipers of God and practitioners of their religion. But I, strive to be 100% orthodox. Now, what people claim is, or some of the propaganda against Islam is that, the really orthodox Muslims are ISIS.
Right. I was just going to ask you that. Like, are you in line with ISIS or any of these sort of organizations or groups in the Middle East who want to create caliphates and kind of convert everybody to Islam and live in a Islamic world?
So the idea of a caliphate is Islamic. It just means the idea that that religion plays a part. When God sends guidance and revelation for humanity, he doesn't limit it to like your personal individual life. God sends guidance for not only you in terms of your personal ethics, but in terms of your marriage, your family life. Like, how should you structure your family life, your household? What about your community? What about society at large? And then ultimately, what about economics, government, foreign policy? These are all domains of human existence, and God didn't leave us without any instructions. There is guidance that God has sent, and this has traditionally been the conception of most religions. Christianity has analogous concepts. Judaism certainly does. Even Hinduism does. But then, because of a secularization process after the Enlightenment in the 18th and 19th century, we get this modern idea of religion. Like, religion, when you pray and you read your holy book, you do that in the privacy of your own home. But everything else in society, that's dictated by, reason and science. And what is reason and science? Well, this is an atheistic, worldview that's devoid of belief in God. That's what really determines our laws. That's what determines our economics, our foreign policy. And this is something that I think is fundamentally irrational, and it's fundamentally immoral. God has sent this kind of guidance. And it's, I think, this is something that I discussed with Patrick Bet-David in the podcast there, and that this is a big problem. This is modernism, to take out God from consideration of the rest of how human beings live and the human experience.
Do you think that the United States has done that? I mean, I feel like the United States still runs heavily on Christian values.
Well, I wish that it was still operating under Christian values, actually. I think that, I grew up in the South, in Texas, and I think the more Christian that the United States has been, the better it's been for Muslims, and, just overall better. In terms of values and family values and the way that society was run. When secularization happens and God is taken out of the picture, then this creates a lot of degeneracy, a lot of problems, a lot of social breakdown. When we look at the breakdown of marriage, some sociologists say that marriage is basically extinct. When we see, the rise of crime, a lot of the problem with crime is the loss of family values and that very stable family structure. When that breaks down, then society breaks down. And the only kind of thing that really guarantees that those structures will persist is a belief in something that's beyond the material, beyond, our everyday animalistic desires. We have to look beyond and see a transcendent source of values. And this is why religion is very important. But you have to really believe in religion and a system of rules. You have to believe in tradition. You have to believe that, okay, we have gotten this kind of practice from generation after generation after generation. That's why you have a Christian tradition, a Jewish tradition, an Islamic tradition. But what modernism does, and what the Enlightenment did, is basically say, no, following people in the past is backwards. It's unenlightened. It's irrational. We have our own ability to develop, the proper way to run life. And maybe, this concept of gender, like that they're male and female, like maybe this is not really rational. Like, let's question that. Let's question sexuality. Let's question, these structures that humans have had traditionally. And so that's the modernist menace that I describe it in my book. And I try to get this point across in my debates.
I mean, I can understand that there's certainly some aspects of society today that are, especially from the crowd that says that they're pro-science, and then they say things like men can become women and women can become men, and it's, there's no science. You can look like one, but you can't actually become. You can't change your chromosomes, which means scientifically you're not able to do that. So, I mean, I understand that there is this sort of, but I think no matter if you pick a time period, any time period in history, you're going to find this sort of backward thinking, no matter what it is. Even when there was a lot of religion in government, for example, and in society, like at the time of Galileo, for example, where you couldn't even say that the earth revolved around the sun without being called a heretic and burnt at the stake. I mean, I understand that we have a level of, what you call degeneracy. I don't know if that's the word I would necessarily use, but I agree that there's some idiotic, thinking that's going on right now. But I don't know if we need to revert back to the times of Galileo, where the church is the end all be all, and that is, even if it goes actually against actually what we know to be reality, what we know to be truth. When would you say if you're saying that now we're in this degenerate time period, when would you say was a better time? Like, what was like the best time that you could point to at this point in history?
Well, I think any time prior to this modern period, especially when we get into the 18th and 19th centuries, when you have these kinds of revolutions happening, these kinds of moral revolutions, societal revolutions in France, for example, these things caused a lot of damage that we're still suffering from today. And when you see, something like the sexual revolution or the pornification of society, a lot of conservatives will say that, oh, I wish we could go back to the 1950s. But in reality, the 1950s was just one stop on this train ride that really originated in the Enlightenment. And I think any time before the Enlightenment, I have my criticisms of Christianity and Judaism as a Muslim. I reject other religions. But in comparison, Christianity in the 1600s or even the 1200s is much better than the situation that we have today. And the thing is, I'm not against reason. I'm not against science. I just think that these things have limits. These things have limits, and ultimately, there's other sources of truth. The problem with the Enlightenment is that it says that, no, the only source of truth and reality is empirical science and perhaps deductive reasoning. This is coming from René Descartes and David Hume and other Enlightenment thinkers. And I think that that's just fundamentally a mistake. Like, so much truth and what we know to be true about the world and about God comes from other than just empirical science. So that's the point that I would make. But I do think there's a big propaganda. Like, you're very familiar with propaganda that's spread online nowadays. And there is this Enlightenment propaganda that if you go back in time, society is worse. And it's like a hellscape. You go back to, the time of Galileo, and this is just this terrible place and no one would ever want to be there. I think this is propaganda. I don't think that people in the past really suffered in the same way that people are suffering now. Like, it's a very lonely, isolated, confused existence that we have. And this is, seen in the statistics on suicide, on depression, on the rate of, use of antidepressants, and all of these problems that we see in today's world. The myth of continuous progress and humans are so much better today than they were 500 years ago. I think we really need to question these kinds of myths.
Just to go to one of the points that you make about empirically studying and saying that, well, some things we cannot empirically study. I think that any truth we can. Maybe we don't have the ability to empirically study at this point. We don't have any actual physical evidence of God, for example, but it doesn't mean that that evidence doesn't exist and won't exist at some point, and that we would have the ability, if we were scientifically advanced enough, to actually empirically study it. I mean, anything that's true, I believe you at some point there is no way around it. You must be able to empirically study it at some point.
Well, the way that
we just might not have the tools. We don't have a microscope that sees God, but maybe one day we would, not that particular instrument, but do you know what I'm saying? Like, something would allow, if something is true, it can always be empirically studied. Sorry.
Well, no problem. Well, think about like moral truths. Like one moral truth that we all implicitly accept is that it's wrong to just hurt someone for no reason, right? But
Right.
is that something that you can ever empirically discover?
If it's true, yes. I think that you would
How
have,
though?
well, because morality, then it's not true. Then you can't call it a truth. You could just call it morality that
Or like
fluctuates.
logical truths, like the law of non-contradiction. Like what kind of observation can you make that would prove the law of non-contradiction?
In what do you mean exactly?
So, like, there are certain logical truths. They're as true as anything can be true. Like, something can't be true and false at the same time in the same way. This is the
Right.
law of non-contradiction. It's universal. Humans have all accepted that that's true. It's like the basis of logic. But that's not an empirical truth. It's not like you can find that through observation. So
Why
in
wouldn't you be able
philosophy,
to?
well, in philosophy, they discuss like different kinds of truths. So there are moral truths, there are empirical truths, there are logical or inferential truths, and there can be other truths that are. It's a truth in the sense that if you reflect on it, like everyone will come to accept that that's the case. So you can just reflect on the law of non-contradiction without any experience and know that it's true. Like those
No,
kinds
you
of
can't
truths.
know it's true. You can assume it's true, right? You would think you believe it's true. That's a belief. You believe it's true. You can't actually know something's true unless you can empirically study it. But my point is, if something is genuinely true, it could be at some point empirically studied. I believe that, for example, many of us don't know whether or not, many of us don't know if God exists. Someday we will know because there will be empirical evidence of God's existence.
Sure, I understand what you're saying. The my I had this debate actually. I debate a lot of atheists, and one of the atheists I debated, well known, his name is Matt Dillahunty. And the atheistic point of view, especially these new atheists, they're also using this kind of Enlightenment reasoning from the 18th century, is to say that, look, the only kinds of truths that we accept are empirical truths. If you can't show me a peer-reviewed study that
Right.
this is the case, then I'm not going to accept it. That I'm just going to say that it's irrational. You have no evidence for it.
Well, there's
And
another alternative, right? And the alternative is
sure,
not to just reject it, but to just say, I don't know. I'm not sure about this because I can't guarantee, I can believe it, but I can't prove that it's true. I have to
well,
go on faith. That's what faith is.
but I would ask you this, just like asking you to reflect, because you believe in God. So, do you believe in God more, or that black holes exist,
Well,
like in space?
black holes for sure.
You believe that like more than your belief in God?
Yeah. Yeah.
But
Belief in
don't you
God
think
is a faith.
that don't you think that that kind of that's not really reflective of like your faith? Like you live your faith every single day and
Well,
you're
I'm not really
practicing
very
it.
religious. I'm personally not religious. I was at
Mhm.
one point. I did convert to Mormonism. I went to 4 years of seminary, which is daily biblical study. Sometimes I get criticized. People say, "You don't know the Bible, Kim." And I'm like, I spent 4 years literally every day studying in class, in seminary. I graduated from seminary. I can't say that for most people. And then continued to study it throughout college. But it's been a long time. I've forgotten a lot. I also have my degree in philosophy. I've forgotten a lot of stuff. I'm
Mhm.
not gonna lie, it's gone out the window. Um, but right, I'm not really religious anymore. I mean, I did have practicing faith, but not as much anymore. And the reason I think is because I don't, I really believe unless you can empirically study it, you cannot prove it to be true. You have to go on faith. I don't think that there's anything wrong with faith. I think it's fine to have that faith. But I do think it's a bit, when we start talking about shaping society, shaping laws, forcing people to live in a certain way based on faith, I think that is, how do I know my faith is right and your faith is wrong? And if I were a faith right now, it would not be Islam. I would not be a Muslim. If anything, I am 100% a Mormon.
Mhm.
So, which is a Zionist, by the way, because they do believe in the literal gathering of Israel. They believe Jews must literally return to Jerusalem in order for there to be a second coming. So if I had any belief at all, I guess that would be it. But then how do we prove who's right? We won't know. I mean, one of us can only be right, though. I mean, in the end,
Sure.
one of us is right and one of us is wrong.
Sure. I'll address that question of force and how can you force people to follow one particular way. But let me go back to the black hole example. The point that I was trying to make is that you're not a cosmologist, right? You haven't actually studied general relativity, and you
Right. So I
haven't
have to
gone
have
through the
faith.
papers.
I have
You
to
just,
believe somebody telling me. Right. Yeah.
yeah, and that's probably 99% of science. All of us, like, we're not keeping up with the studies. Even me, my degree from Harvard is in physics, and I got a secondary in philosophy. But the point is that a lot of what people think that they are very sure of, that they believe in science, is really from testimony of others and a kind of general social acceptance that yes, science is the whole truth and nothing but the truth. But if you reflect for, I would say, Christians, majority of Christians and other religious people, they have this kind of personal feeling of God. And when you look at childhood studies, because there's a study of like the cognitive science of religion, when you look at children, regardless of their cultural background, it's universal actually to believe in a creator God. And they
Hmm.
studied this and they compared, British children with Japanese children. There was an Oxford researcher named Olivera Petrovich. She wrote a book about this, where in Japan, their actual society doesn't believe in a creator God, and Shintoism doesn't believe in a creator God. Yet when you ask Japanese children, like, who made the mountains, like who made the sun, they'll say God. Like, God
Right.
made those things. And this is a surprising result. It's like a universal thing. Just like children have certain moral intuitions and they have certain logical intuitions and they develop them over time, empirical intuitions. They also have theistic, they have a theistic or a natural theology. And this is something universal. So what the cognitive scientists say is that belief in God is something that is as ingrained and as
Right.
intuitive as logical beliefs, empirical beliefs, etc. So I don't want to belabor that, but going back to the question of force, like, so
Right, because then whose God is the right God, right? And that's kind of the crux of the question, because if we're going to start forcing society to mold to certain religious laws, then you'd have to be able to prove that your God is the right God and not the God that maybe I believe in, that is a more spiritual, non-religious, God.
Sure. So the first point I'll make is that Islam doesn't really force everyone to believe in Islam. And in Islamic history, this is found in the Quran itself, and it's found in the practice of the Prophet Muhammad and his followers, that you can have a society where it's Muslim control, it's like caliphate, but you have people of the book, meaning Jews and Christians, and then some other religions as well. Some scholars considered Hindus to be people of the book,
Oh,
or
interesting.
Zoroastrians. So they can also practice their religion according to their conscience. They can teach their children their religion. It's not like a exactly 100% religious freedom in the sense of America today, but I would say it's arguably more religious freedom in the sense that today secular society will prevent Christians, like in Europe, from teaching certain verses of the Bible because it's hateful, right? Or you're not allowed to, if your child goes to school and they somehow convince your child that you're not a boy, you're actually a girl, the school can actually intervene and take custody of your children.
Right, right.
This would not exist, if Islam was the law of the land.
But there would be
So
dimitude, and that's what you're kind of referring to, is that these people of the book could practice their religion, but there would be some rules and restrictions, even payments that would have to be made, right?
yes, so like the payment is called jizya, but dhimmi, being a dhimmi, means a protected person. So yes, there is a jizya, and yes, Islam is supposed to be the law of the land, so there is that kind of status. But there's also certain benefits. So when it comes to like military service, the dhimmi, the non-Muslim, doesn't have to serve in the military, whereas Muslims would have to have that kind of conscription in the Islamic military, for example. So but let me put the point in a different way. Like, we talk about, dhimmitude in Islam, and you're this kind of second-class citizen. Well, guess what? In today's secular society, all religious people are dhimmis. We're dhimmis, and the law of the land is based on atheism. And it's these laws that are imposed on everyone that we are forced to abide by. We are forced to abide by the law of the land that's determined on the basis of atheism. Why? Because there's this idea of separation of church and state. You can be a Christian or a Muslim and go to Congress or be president or whatever, but you have to leave your religious beliefs at the door of Congress. You can't take your religious beliefs to the halls of power and legislate on that basis. That means what you can legislate on the basis of is atheism. Yeah, so the laws that we have in this country, in any country that everyone follows, in a secular country, you're forced to abide by them on threat of being killed because you break the law, and the police can even violating, traffic law, or you get a parking ticket. If you don't refuse to pay the parking ticket or that traffic fine, then the government can put a lien on your house and confiscate your house, and then the sheriff is going to come to evict you from your property, which is now the government's property. And if you refuse, they can kill you, right? They can shoot to kill, they can arrest you and you resist, and then they can actually kill you. So this is all based on violence, forcing people to abide by laws that they don't determine for themselves. It's determined in the halls of Congress. Even if you have like a naive view of how politics works and it's the will of the people, let's just assume there's that and there's no corruption and special interest and all of that. But even in that rosy picture of representational democracy, religion doesn't play a part in that. God doesn't play a part of that. Even if you personally don't have this scientific, materialistic worldview, you have a religious worldview, you will be forced to abide by an atheistic standard of laws at the threat of extreme violence.
Mm-hmm. So, but isn't it better? Like, I understand that we're making laws that are based on, we're always making laws based on something, right? There's got to be, people have to kind of pick in a society what they're going to revolve their laws around, whether it's going to be around a religion, which in some societies they've done that, or whether it's going to be around no religion, but our country is based on property and property rights and securing property. I would say even our military goes around the world securing property, right? They're trying to gain property maybe from others, from other countries, from their property, trying to protect shipping routes, like whatever, but just trying to, I would say, protect commerce. And we're not going to get into whether or not we think that's moral or immoral. I think we probably have an agreement on the military industrial complex around the world. But when you start making laws religiously, so either way, it sounds to me like a pick and choose. You're going to end up with this, no matter what, we have to live, unless we're going to choose to live in a lawless society where nobody's punished for anything. You have to choose what you're going to be living under. And so you would assert that you think it's better to live under religious laws rather than these other laws that we create based on a shared morality from voting.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I think that the only thing that we're allowed to vote on is, atheism, basically. That's not much of a choice. But if I were to choose, and I would, given a choice of what I want to abide by, obviously Islam would be number one, but then number two would be Christianity, actually.
Interesting.
Christianity, maybe even Judaism, like going down the list of Abrahamic faiths, but that's traditional society is far better than the kind of atheistic modernist society that we have today. I think that it's really a cancer. It's destroying humanity. Really, the human race is at stake because of scientific transhumanism, with these kinds of technologies that are being pushed through capitalistic enterprise. There's really no end in sight in what they're willing to do to transform. They started with transforming, society, then the family, then even our human bodies, even like birth. You have artificial wombs now that are really being rolled out. There's investments in them. There's Neuralink and changing human psychology, whether it's uploading the mind to the cloud or taking certain pharmaceuticals that alter brain states, alter your psychology. It's a real dystopia that's coming to fruition. And now you have AI. So this is all putting the human race at stake, at risk from extinction. And what contributes to that? It's all coming from the Enlightenment. That the dominoes that have been falling since the Enlightenment, we're ending we're reaching the end of that, which is the end of the human race. So any kind of traditional religion, why? Because the problem, let me tell you the problem that I have with modernist Enlightenment philosophy that all the world is run by at this point because of Western hegemony. It's this idea that the only thing that matters is freedom and equality. Freedom and equality are the only values that we should value. And I think this is very contradictory to human nature and all religions, because religions say, no, 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 freedom and equality are good things. You know, people should have the choice to a certain extent. It's just not an absolute choice. People should have equality in certain ways, but it's not an absolute equality of all people. There are other values, like the value of marriage, like the value of family, like the value of children, the value of God, the value of communal traditions. There are other values, and if you just prioritize freedom and equality above everything, then you end up eliminating like humanity. And the gender example, I think maybe a conservative audience in this day and age will relate to the most, is the idea of gender is like a tradition, right? Tradition of you have men and female, and it's also based on biology, obviously. But if you say that everyone is equal and everyone is exactly the same, then that is coming from this Enlightenment mentality and philosophy that predates 1950s Leave It to Beaver America. And you have this erasure of the tradition of a gendered tradition, gendered values. There's gender roles, being a man, a manly man, being a woman. These things get erased because you say that equality is the most important value, and you can't really have equality if you say that there are gender roles. Because if you have a role, that restricts your freedom, it restricts your choice. No, you should be able to, as a male, to say that you're a woman. And as a male, you should be able to dress however you want and do whatever you want, act however you want. That's freedom. But if you value that over everything else, then you have to erase gender. You have to erase marriage. You have to erase family. You have to say, okay, who said that marriage is between a man and a woman? We can have marriage between, if you want to be two men, two women, a man and an animal, or whatever. That's perfectly fine, because it's your free choice and we're all equal. So my problem is not with freedom and equality. Those are important, good values. They're in Islam. But there has to be limits to those things. And that's what traditionalism has had, whether it's Islamic traditionalism or Christian traditionalism. The problem with in the Enlightenment and modernism is it's totalizing. Only freedom and equality matter.
But with freedom and equality mattering, it doesn't mean that there's an erasure of all these other things. I mean, we've seen an uptick, for example, in marriage. We know that there were more marriages in 2022 than there were in the previous years, in the previous 2021 and 2020 and 2019, I even believe. So clearly a lot of people chose to get married, and they even did so during the pandemic. They met, they fell in love. I was one of those, got married, had a pandemic marriage, basically. So it doesn't, whether a person believes and has traditional values, or I should say has enlightened values and chooses to go into this enlightened path of freedom and equality, it doesn't mean we suddenly erase all these things. I mean, I think it's a bit of a straw man to say, well, if we allow men and men to marry and women to marry, suddenly men are going to marry animals, when obviously the animal doesn't have any choice on that. There's not it's one thing for two thinking adults to make a decision to marry one another, but you can't have a man marrying a dog when the dog doesn't even understand what's going on and what that marriage is about, right?
There are persons who identify as dogs.
Well, okay, then they can identify as a dog and get married as a dog, I suppose. We don't have to actually, as society, identify them as a dog on the actual paperwork. If they want to dress up like a dog all day, every day. Yeah. Well, I mean, certainly there is an aspect of society that's going a bit crazy on that, but I'm saying that one doesn't have to, you don't have to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I mean, just because you want freedom and equality, and then you say, well, freedom and equality leads to all of these, leads to pornographic culture, leads to people being so woke that they believe they could become and identify as a dog or a toaster oven or whatever. Right. I mean, freedom and equality can lead to insanity, but it doesn't necessarily have to lead to insanity. And we can always put limits on the insanity, right? We can say that's just insane and we're not going to do that. But I want to go back. So
those limits are exactly what I'm talking about. Like, we put limits on the basis of what? And those limits, in my opinion,
on reality, on science.
Tradition. Well, what is reality, right? So Science doesn't say, like, so if you say that, for example, science says there's a male chromosome and a female chromosome, well, that can be changed. Genetic engineering can actually alter our DNA. And so the technology and the science will allow people to choose literally like what they want to be. Like the thing that
Yeah.
really grounds gender is a kind of transcendent metaphysical truth that this is how God has created us. The soul is gendered. There's a male soul and a female soul. So this is actually a limitation of the conservative critique against transgenderism. They just limit it to biology. And yes, biology is important, and our souls are in gendered bodies that God has also created. But if you just limit it to science, and this is what science says, there's male and female, well, technology will allow actually a lot of things to happen in the future, like changing your genes, changing the chromosome. And then what will the conservatives say then? They won't really have any response unless they take it back to God says, God has drawn these limits. And I think that some of these things are shared universally across religions. It's not a Muslim specific thing or a Christian specific thing. Certain things like gender are universal, actually. And I think those values are worth preserving.
So if we go back to pre-Enlightenment, if you say the Enlightenment is kind of the disaster of society, and we go back prior to that point, I mean, you're talking about taking away the freedom and equality of more than half the population. So you'd have all women would no longer be given the freedom and the ability to do and live however women want to live. That men would be given that ability, but women would not. And then there would be enslavement, right? Then you've got a separate class of men, even not just women, but a separate class of men. And different time periods chose different people to enslave. So I guess, pick whoever. That group of people would then be enslaved as well. I mean, do you think that it's okay to go back to those times where women are just like, I wouldn't be allowed to do, in your perfect world, you wouldn't be talking to me here doing this, right?
Well, I think in a perfect world, like there is opportunities for what's called dawah, or speaking about religion and inviting other people to accept Islam. So that's not going to be foreclosed. But the idea of gender roles, that is a value that I hold. That is a value that Christians traditionally have held, Muslims traditionally have held and still hold. And gender roles shouldn't be seen as a restriction in the sense that, oh, you're a slave. Yes. So in Islam, there are gendered rules. Like men and women do have different rules. And this is on the basis of God's revelation. Why? Because men and women aren't the same. Treating men and women as if they have the same body, the same psychology, the same mentality, the same personality traits. This is actually injustice. It's actually going to lead to real oppression. Because
right. Can I just cut in
Sure.
for just 1 second about that? Because that kind of goes back to the equality that you brought up earlier, that, but I don't think being equal means we're the same. Like, I believe here in the United States, you and I are equals. We have equal rights. We have equal opportunities. We're equal in every way, but we are definitely not the same people. I mean, you're all the way in Texas. I'm here. We're very different people. We're obviously different people. And I'm sure you've got skills that I don't have, and I have skills that you don't have. We are not the same. I'm sure in an arm wrestling match, you'd beat me, but it doesn't mean that we're not equal. So there is, there is a group in society that is trying to create an equality that turns us all into unisex. Everybody's just given the same things. This is kind of the criticism. People are saying, oh my gosh, we're becoming communists, right? Because then everybody will be given the same amount of money and it won't matter what type of effort they put out, right? There is that criticism for sure, but that doesn't mean, but equality comes in many forms. That's just one definition of equality. And it's a definition I don't agree with, and I think most people don't actually agree with it.
Well, my definition of equality it's the Islamic definition, is that men and women are equal in terms of spiritually before God. In Islam, men and women are seen as equal, and we're judged only on the basis of our piety and our righteousness and our service of God. So a woman who prays and fasts and is a servant of God is going to be at the same level as a man who does the same thing as well. All things being equal, they're spiritually at the same level and therefore equal. But in terms of their roles in society, I think it's a mistake and it's a disaster to think that women can do everything that men can do and men can do everything that women can do. This is something that is just belied by basic biology. basic, science of psychology, men and women are very, very different. So in my ideal role, women would see it as their priority, and men would see it as the priority for women to be primarily as mothers, caretakers, nurturing the next generation, rather than being in the halls of power or in the public domain working alongside men. This is something that has caused a disaster, in society. Like when you look at, this is part of the breakdown in marriage, because if you tell women that, okay, go into a workplace and sit alongside other men, human beings are human beings. People have desires. They fall into fornication and adultery. This is something that every religion has seen as a disaster because it destroys marriage, it destroys family. But in the modern world, it's just normalized. Men and women should sit together, and Islam is not against women working per se, just against women and men mixing together in a kind of sexualized environment that causes, the Me Too movement. It was interesting. Fallout of the Me Too movement, that a lot of men in the corporate world said, look, I'm not going to meet with you privately if you're the opposite sex, because I don't want any accusations thrown at me or suspicions. And this is actually an Islamic thing. If you go farther back, it's a Christian thing too. It's a traditional thing,
Right.
that men and women shouldn't be privately meeting with each other, because it raises an eyebrow. It raises like, okay, what are they really doing behind closed doors? And this is kind of it's like the secular world discovered that after the Me Too movement, but it's not like a new discovery. Muslims and other traditional people have been practicing this for centuries, for generations. So there's a right way to live, I think. And you can try to discover it on your own and fall into all kinds of harms and disasters, and maybe eventually you won't figure it out. Or you can rely on God. You can rely on revelation. You can rely on God giving guidance. And God said, yeah, don't mix with the opposite gender. Don't dress in kind of provocative ways to entice others towards lust, etc. So these are the kinds of values that are gendered. It's gender rolled, and it's
Sure.
kind of an enlightenment or atheistic propaganda to say, oh, this is oppressing the opposite sex, or women are
Well,
second-class citizens.
it is, if you think that a law should be created that forces this. Like, do you think that men and women should not be like legally allowed to go to lunch with each other or be alone with each other? Or should we have laws that are actually like that follow these traditional, I would say Christian and Islamic values on that? Like I said, I was very Mormon for many years. This is a Mormon value as well. More, in the Mormon, but it's not a law. If you do it, you're not going to be admonished. You're not going to have to go in and confess your sins like you went out and had lunch with somebody of the opposite sex that was married. It's just something you should not do. It's definitely frowned upon. It's societal in society, in Mormon society, it's not accepted. So, but there's no law on that. But in places like Saudi Arabia, there is a law on that. So would you want to make that type of law if you had the world the way you wanted it?
So historically, there have been laws against things like fornication or adultery, including in the United States. Even less than 100 years ago, even in maybe less than 20 years ago, there were laws against sodomy, for example. And these laws protected society from degeneracy. But maybe you wouldn't use that word, but the point is that laws are one way to regulate society and human behavior, and we shouldn't have too much of a statist mentality, because traditionally in societies, you also regulate behavior through social norms and taboos. So it's not
Right.
necessarily the police coming and breaking down your door, or the police like spying on you. Like, if you think about the level of control that the modern state has on all of us as citizens, it is far more tyrannical and authoritarian than anything that has existed historically. Like, even in the most hardcore Sharia caliphate, they didn't have, all of this kind of surveillance where the government can turn on your phone and
Yeah.
remotely and listen to your conversations, monitor your movements, restrict your travel, force you to inject yourself with whatever new vaccine and mandate that, force you to, like, the level of control that exists in the modern state on each of our behaviors. Like, this is a overwhelming force bearing down on all of us. We're just conditioned through the public schooling system and through media not to notice that as such. But such kind of control of the state on all of us did not exist prior to these technologies. And all that you would see like in a traditional Islamic state is like, okay, there's a social norm. So if you as a woman were seen with a strange man, people would raise their eyebrows. Your mom would get mad at you, or, oh, you're bringing shame to our family, and the neighbors are talking. So that you would prevent yourself, or I would prevent myself from engaging in that behavior just because of the social taboo. I think that's a healthy society. It's not like, okay, the feds are going to bust down your door because you did this or that. There are certain
Right.
things that should be regulated at the state level. Like I said, punishments for sexual crimes, that those have existed in all societies, and it's something that's preserved in Islam. But these are rational things, and they can be rationally defended. And Christians, I don't think would have any problems with some of these provisions. They only have a problem insofar as they've bought into this kind of Enlightenment lie, and this valuing of freedom and equality over everything else, even the laws of God.
What about honor killing? So if I do something that's going to bring shame to my family, from your view, what's the rule on honor killings?
There's no honor killing in Islam. Like you're not allowed as a father or brother or family member to actually kill or assault your family member. Again, it's all based on taboo. If someone is proven to have committed adultery, then they would be punished through lashes, or if they're married and they commit adultery, then that's punished through stoning. And this is the law that exists in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Bible. They had it in Judaism. In Christianity, canon law, the Catholic Church prescribed lashes for sexual crimes. So if it's proven in a court of law through due process, not your brother or your father like getting pissed because, oh, I saw you with a boy, therefore I'm going to kill you, that's barbaric. That's something
Mm-hmm.
completely rejected in all major religions. But if there's due process, there's a criminal court, basically, it's proven, then that is the punishment of God. And this has been recognized in both Judaism, Christianity, and Islam.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that adultery should be illegal and punishable by death. But I will say that people listening might find that to be, oh my gosh, you think that somebody could be stoned to death. And I always think we electrocuted people to death. I mean, there is some really insane stuff that we have done. I don't think that we as Americans or even Christian culture have any right to criticize how any other country does capital punishment, considering we'd literally fry people. That to me is like some of the most barbaric stuff I've ever heard. I
But
want to get
people,
into, yeah, go
sorry to
ahead.
interrupt you, but people who have been cheated on, they might have a different kind of perspective on that. And there's some really sad, horrific stories of because of DNA tests nowadays.
Oh
You
yeah, right.
have people who are gifted by their children, oh, 23andMe, let's get this DNA test. And then they find out like he's a father of 5 children, or so he thought. And actually his wife was cheating all
Right.
these years. None of those children are his. Even though he raised them, they're in their 20s. So what a nightmare, like that kind of harm and trauma. And it also, it's not only destroys him as a person, but if this is rampant in society, it really destroys the fabric of society. So there really needs to be a harsh deterrent against it. And that's, why we see it in many religions, like the same kind of
Hmm.
deterrent.
I guess I just don't think that punishment is a good deterrent. I think what's a good deterrent is education and instilling certain values. I can agree that I think our society has, I do agree, and I am a woman that works, but I do agree that there is a natural biological element to women nurturing, and women are naturally, I think, typically the caretaker of the family, the caretaker of the children. But should that be forced on the woman? Everybody is a bit different. There are some men who are better at it than women. I was raised by my father, for example. I think that there's like nuances there, and I think that's why I don't want conformity and laws around that conformity, because there are so many, because people are unique and circumstances are unique, and
And
I've
people have the
seen.
choice, like in Islam, like this ideal or perfect Islamic society that we're talking about. People aren't forced to get married. People aren't forced to have kids. People aren't forced to, just take that kind of route if they don't want to. And that's acknowledged within Islamic law. Like some people, they don't have any desire to be married or have children. They want to read, they want to study, they want to go
Right.
do something else. There's just certain lines that are drawn in Islam to protect people, to protect society. I mentioned the, preventing gender mixing, the importance of modesty. Those are things that I don't really see as these overbearing type of tyrannical restrictions. It's just that we're in a different culture in the West, in the modern West, and we've kind of forgotten what societies really did look like. Like the idea of veiling, like people have
Right.
a big issue with veiling or the burqa. Oh, covering the face. Oh, what a barbaric practice. Like women are dressed like in this kind of way and they're restricted in this way. But people forget, or they don't know that veiling exists in every pre-modern culture, including Christian culture. You look at some of the 15th and 16th century paintings of women, and they're veiled, or
Hmm.
depictions of the Virgin Mary. She's always covering her hair or even covering her face. It's the
Right.
Virgin Mary wearing a burqa. So this is like, we are so out of touch with that kind of tradition and that history that things that we'll point out about Islam seem like very weird or foreign, when really they're not. It's based on really basic human values that are shared universally.
Yeah. I mean, I hear you. I hear you on that. I just also, from my experience of being a Mormon for many years, for, 15 years, I practiced. There certainly modesty is a really big aspect of Mormon culture. Mormons cover up, don't wear, sleeveless, no sleeveless tops, nothing low cut. Shorts and skirts are always at least at the knee. There's a lot of modesty there, but it's not enforced in a way that is negative. There's just a positive. I can see the difference between a positive encouragement towards certain behaviors versus a punishing. That's one reason why I joined the Mormon church. My family was Catholic, and Catholics are, it's just like shame all the time. You repent all the time. You're a sinner. It's very negative. It felt very negative to me when I'd go to Catholic church. And then I go to Mormon church and it was positive, and there was no such thing as hell really. And, everything was the way they encouraged you to live a modest and chaste life of don't have sex until you get married, don't watch rated R movies, don't cuss, like all of these things that they find to be virtuous, that keep a person healthy and virtuous. They did it in a positive. It was a positive encouragement rather than a slap. You're going to be punished if you don't do this. When people felt punished, they automatically revolted. I mean, there's like a natural rebellion that happens when people feel like the man is going to get me, society is going to get me, I'm going to be punished, I'm going to be stoned to death. That has a more negative I think that people kind of say, oh, okay, well, whatever, even though the punishment is very harsh compared to if they're positively encouraged to behave in a certain way, if that makes sense.
Yeah, there's an interesting study that I read a long time ago, but it's very relevant. They were looking at churches in the United States, and they were looking at churches that had a lot of restrictions. Like they had church service on Sunday, but it's at 7 a.m., for example, and there's no like music, or there's not really anything like rock music, and women had to dress very modestly and cover their hair, and it's just like more strict, and more fire and brimstone, the teaching.
Right.
And then they look at churches that are more liberal and more positive psychology. Let's encourage people, let's make it relaxed, come as you are. Let's have some more modern music, and they want to see which of those churches are growing and which of the churches are actually decreasing in attendance and maybe even shuttering. And they found that the more hard-nosed churches were persevering, they were lasting, they're growing in their numbers, whereas the others that are kind of more accommodating to the dominant culture, those were the churches
Mm-hmm.
that were shuttering. And this was seen as a paradox. Like, well, why? The researchers were asking themselves, why would that be the case? We would think that people want to go to what's more comfortable. And the answer that they came to is that, well, the more hard-nosed churches, they're actually offering something that's different than the dominant culture. And they're
Yeah.
kind of imbibing this kind of identity that people feel like that kind of enforcement or reinforcement really does a better job of getting people to identify with the church, as opposed to thinking, oh, this is something that's fun. I can go to my church and enjoy some rock music and just sit back and socialize, or I can just go to everything else that society offers. This is exactly like, what my church offers. So the church doesn't have a unique value proposition when it's just like the rest of society. So I think that might be a little bit of a
Well, Mormonism is
yeah.
one of the most restrictive religions in the United States. I mean, I think it's as restrictive, if not more restrictive than Islam in many, many ways. I mean, you're talking about there's no rock music at a Mormon church. You do have to be modest. You cannot even drink coffee, tea. You can't cuss. You can't watch rated R movies. You can't wear tank tops. You can't have sex until you're married. You can't even really make out until you're married. I mean, it is one of the single most restrictive religions, and it is very fast growing. It does have a massive growth rate, much because of the proselytizing. But so I understand that. It is still, though, a positive religion. It is still rooted in positivity. I mean, I'm not here trying to convert people to Mormonism, but just, maybe you are trying to convert people to Islam, I'm sure. But I still, it is still a highly, highly, highly restrictive religion. If out of all the Christian religions, the single most restrictive. I'm confident in that, and but still also one of the most positive. And I think it works, and I think that's why it grows, because people like that structure. They do like in Mormon religion, you have to pray at minimum 3 times a day. You're reading your scriptures at least twice a day. We graduated from seminary, for goodness sakes. They stick us through religious school from the time we're in the 9th grade. It is a very, very restrictive, intense religion. 3 hours of church on Sundays, plus during the week, multiple times that you got to go in for different, organizations and activities. But I still think positivity is the way to go. But,
well,
we might not agree.
positivity, I agree. There's a lot of positivity in Islam too. And if that's what you mean by positivity, like you have restrictions, but there's also a positive message. And Islam is like that as well. There are a lot of
Well, it's just not that you're going to be harshly punished. You're not going to be killed if you don't behave in the way. They're just going to, what happens, like if you're not behaving in the way that they want, or the way that they teach in the Mormon religion, you just get pulled aside nicely, and they
that's
just
the
say,
same. That's the same in Islam. Like
but they're not going to they're not going to stone you to death if you commit
adultery
adultery.
is an extreme crime. Adultery is like.
But even then, Mormons don't believe in stoning somebody to death over it.
What if someone is, a child molester, in the Mormon church? Are they going to just take him aside and educate him and tell him, you shouldn't be diddling little kids in the closet?
No, I mean, if you break the laws, then you should go to jail.
Who defines the law, right? Who defines the law?
Right, yeah, right. And in the state of Utah, most of it's done by Mormons. Mormons actually control most of the laws in that state. So most of the state laws are controlled by Mormons.
Sometimes harsh punishments are justified, right? So you don't have a problem with stoning per se. You just think that adultery is not a serious enough crime to justify that. But you don't have a problem with stoning.
And in Utah, it would be the firing squad.
Yeah, or the firing squad.
They do it through, right. They do it through firing squad, and it's for religious reasons. But it's, but yeah, only certain, very, very, very certain crimes would be punished by death.
That's like in Islam. There are only certain crimes are punished by death.
But adultery is one of them.
It's a serious crime. Adultery is a serious crime. No.
Everybody should be killed.
I don't want to believe that. I don't want to believe that everyone cheats.
Sadly, I think.
Unfortunately, a lot of people do, but that's because of the breakdown in marriage. That's because there's no deterrent. If there was a harsh deterrent like stoning, then I think a lot fewer people would be cheating.
I just have to ask you, we're running out of time, and I don't want to keep you because I know I've told you about an hour, but I do just have to touch on these other, and look, if people want to hear your full viewpoints on these subjects that are really rough, that are, I would say, harsher, like the child marriage or slavery or whatever, you have many debates that are out there where you've debated these ad nauseum. There was one I watched that was like 4 hours long. So you've done these debates many times over. We'll put some of the links down below. But, going back to this pre-Enlightenment vision of the world. So now, not only would there be these roles and what we're supposed to be doing, but there would be child marriage, and there would be, well, I don't, let's not talk about child marriage, because
let's talk about it, because you've mentioned it a few times. So I think I should just say a few words about it.
Okay. Child marriage.
Yeah. So it's, I prefer the term minor marriage. But the reality about the modern world is that children are very sexually active. children in the modern world are very sexually active. And
When you
this,
say, so can we like clarify on age? Because you've said minor versus children. So like what age group are you talking about?
so that's the whole debate, right? The whole debate is about who defines what a child is and what an adult is. And historically, that dividing line has been on the basis of puberty. You go through puberty, and puberty can start as young as 6 or 7 years old. About 4% of girls complete puberty by age 9 in America today, according to the US Department of Health. But the point is that defining, what's funny is that conservatives have this kind of biological definition of man versus woman. And this is why transgenderism is wrong, because we have man and woman. That's a biological fact. Well, then
Right.
what is the biological fact of defining a child versus an adult? And when you
Uh-huh.
start talking about biology, then conservatives suddenly say, no, 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 it's what society says. Society says 18. But this is a very artificial number. It's based, if you look at history, the number 18 was only arrived at because of modern schooling and this kind of program to socialize, also because of the Enlightenment, socialize the population according to this public education program. And then you finish 18, your high school, then you go into the workforce. But it's all
Yeah.
artificial. Biologically, historically, religions and cultures, they defined adulthood at puberty. And this is why when you look at marriage practices, not only of Muslims, but of Christians, Jews, Hindus, and Chinese, etc., is based on puberty. And you have this minor marriage, meaning under 18. So
Okay.
in some places, the average age that girls are getting married is 14 or 15,
Hmm.
getting married as young as 8 or 9 years old. So this is something that has been practiced. And the only reason that we have a problem with it, it's happening. Like 8 and 9 year olds, like I went to public school in Houston, and in elementary school, some of the kids were sexually active. And the response from the school system is say, oh, as long as you're having safe sex, you have to have safe sex. And they're not even trying to discourage
About
it.
8 and 9 year olds, I don't know.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
don't know if it's that young. I mean,
Well, maybe
look,
I
the
wasn't
average.
grew up in a rough part of Houston, but
I
that
guess
was happening.
so. I mean, I definitely think that that puberty. I mean, I understand and I agree that the age of adulthood is arbitrary. You say artificial. I kind of say arbitrary. Like society kind of will determine. We've put it at 18. Many of us think it should be older. At this point, I look at kids that are like 22, and I'm like, you are still stupid and young, and you should not be an adult. But yeah, certain and the time has changed. There was back in in my grandfather's time at 16 years old, the kids had to take charge of the family and start providing for their families. So why couldn't they be adults at 16 if they're running the entire family farm because their dad was killed, right? Or something happened in a war. Or they're being sent off to war at 16 years old, and yet they're not considered adults. So I understand that this is arbitrary. I do agree that I've had, I'm going to say something controversial, so you won't be the only one. I've always felt like the term pedophilia should only be for prepubescent. Like you're a pedophile if you are going after prepubescent children, because that's a different. Once somebody has gone through puberty, it is harder to know how old they actually are, right? A girl that is 15 could look like she's 22, and so that's difficult. And I can't say a guy is a pedophile for being attracted to a 15-year-old when the 15-year-old looks 22 years old. When you stand her next to a 22-year-old and he's attracted to both of them and they both look exactly the same, how can I then say, well, you're just a pedophile simply because this one happens to be 15 years old? To me, it's a very distinct sexual lust that is after a distinct sexual, proclivity, right, which is for young prepubescents. So I can understand this, and I agree with that. But most girls and boys, I think, start the puberty process, I would say at like 12 years old. And they kind of finish it maybe
Well,
around 16.
biologically, there's different stages of puberty, and for girls there's like 5 stages, and having the period is like the fourth stage. It's like the almost the last stage. So having the period is not the beginning of puberty, it's actually towards the end. And the average is 12 years old when they have that period, or 12 or 13.
Right.
But the other aspects of puberty, like the hormones, the secondary sex characteristics, the lust or desire, that starts well before the period, for girls.
I don't know. I would say 12. Girls still look like little girls, and then they have their
Mm.
period, and then they start developing hips. And you need those hips if you're going to make the argument that a girl can marry at puberty, and because then you would have to make the argument that she could then be childbearing. I would say that the period is not the indicator of being ready, but it's the hips and whether or not the hips have fully formed, because she's got to be able to push out a giant baby.
Yeah.
So, and if you want to do that without destroying her body, then you've got to ensure that those hips are fully formed. And that doesn't happen until well after the period starts at 12 years old.
From the biology, because I had a whole debate about this, the hips actually do form before the period. They fill out in terms of fat, but in terms of bone structure, they do form before the period. It's because the puberty stages begin, like the period, as I mentioned, is the penultimate, the fourth stage.
I
But
think
other
we can
things,
see a difference between a 12-year-old and a 16-year-old girl. I mean, their hips are different.
yeah, it's because of fat, and because they grow in size, like, but in terms of the width of the hip and like the proportions, those are set by the time they have their period. Then they're 90% formed. So yeah, there's
Okay.
10% more, but I mean, those biological facts we can discuss. But the point is that historically, traditionally, you define adulthood by biology. And this is why, according to canon law, like the minimum age of marriage in the Catholic Church was 12 years old, always. And a lot of the church writings, or from the church fathers early in Christianity, there were apocryphal gospels that talked about Mary being betrothed to Joseph when she was 12 years old, and that was the Jewish custom. And so she was married at 12, and she wasn't, and then she became pregnant before actually cohabiting with Joseph. So cohabitation happened at 16. So between 12 and 16, there was the Immaculate Conception, basically. And so she was a minor, right? So this is when Christians especially like criticize Muslims, and they say, you are in support of minor marriage. I point to the fact that, look, you believe that the Virgin Mary was impregnated by
Yeah.
God as a minor, under 16 years old. And that's something that they don't really have a response to. But I want to point to the larger discrepancy. Like, okay, gender is something that is male and female based on biology. Childhood and adulthood is also something that's determined by biology. And there's a bell curve, there's a bell curve. Some go through puberty later or earlier, and then there's an average.
So then you would leave it up to who? I mean, the government can't go and individually assess whether or not the person is finished with puberty before they're. I mean, I guess maybe
No, but
if
that's
you would.
actually the case. Like in the US, there is no minimum age of marriage in most states. And what the law says is that, okay, if a minor wants to get married, it's through only consent of the parents.
Right.
And sometimes they have to go before a judge. But there are thousands, like in the past decade alone, I think there's over 100,000 minor marriages that take place in the United States.
Look, I'm from Idaho. I went to school with girls that were married while we were still in high school. I mean, once they hit 16, 15 or 16, their parents signed off on their marriage to somebody. And yes, their parents had to give consent. Their parents had to allow it. And I did go to school with some. I mean, it was rare, and we did think it was weird culturally, but it's allowed.
I think it's a better
Right.
practice. I think that society would be much better if we had that type of early marriage, where
Well, we do, but you're saying we do, but we just don't choose to do it. I mean,
it's
people
not
just.
socially acceptable. I wish it was something that was socially acceptable and seen as a
Oh, so
positive
that's a
thing.
different thing.
Yeah.
I don't think it should be socially acceptable. I mean, it's one thing if it's legal. I can understand, because I agree that, we do kind of pick an arbitrary, we're like, okay, 18, and it's that's today's society. Previous societies, it was younger, whatever. But really to make it socially acceptable. So
But previous societies, like having sex outside of marriage, like as a girlfriend and boyfriend, that's acceptable for minors as young as even 12 years old. Fine, you don't think it's very common for 9-year-olds to be engaged. I agree,
I don't think
but
it's even common
by
for
when you get to
12-year-olds.
in middle school,
Yeah, I don't. I think that kids start to experiment sexually 16, 15, 16. I mean, maybe some at 14, the early ones, but I think 16 is like pretty typical when you could expect that your teenager is maybe fooling around and you probably got to keep an eye on what's going on.
sure, but
Yeah.
let's like give a lower end estimate and say that 10% of minors by the age of 14 have had their first sexual experience. Society is fine with that 10% number. Like there's no effort to say that, okay, these 14-year-olds or these 13-year-olds, few as they may be, shouldn't be engaged in that, and we should find
Right.
measures to stop it. So it is socially acceptable. Why is that socially acceptable but not marriage, is the question that I have. So why can't it be socially acceptable for an 18-year-old to marry a 14-year-old or a 13-year-old? Like that kind of minor marriage, they're like, it's fine for a 17-year-old to be sexually involved with a 14-year-old or younger,
Yeah.
but somehow marriage makes it weird or makes it somehow illegal or offensive. I don't understand the logic of that.
Well, the logic, I think, would have nothing to do with morality at all. It would just have to do with economics. I mean, an 18-year-old, anybody under the age of 18 is not really able to support themselves because the jobs out there are not hiring 16-year-olds for first full-time jobs where they could then get an apartment and rent it, especially when they're married to a 13-year-old. I mean, there's just no economics in that. In today's society, you have to be older. I think we could even make an argument that in today's society, 18 is not even able to get married and support themselves. They would have to live with their parents
Yeah,
and
what's
be
wrong with that?
married, living with your parent. Well, because that's not what marriage should be. Marriage traditionally should be you've gotten married and you've left the nest. You've flown, you're out.
Well, actually, 50% of even 25-year-olds or even up to 30-year-old, I think, still live with their parents now because
And
of
they're not married.
hard
And they're not
economic
married.
times.
Yeah,
so
but they're not married.
either they're
Failure to
celibate,
launch.
or which is sad, or they're fornicating. So why not like have a better system? Like, okay, 18-year-old, you don't have to leave the nest. Like who gives that standard? Like that seems to
Yeah.
be a very capitalistic consumerist standard because you're forced to buy a whole separate household as opposed to just living with your parents, and you're slowly working, you're making money, you don't have to pay rent, you can save because you're saving on cost of living, you build up that nest egg, and then you can actually buy a house instead of
Yeah.
relying on rent or having to pay exorbitant amount of interest on a mortgage. So it's like there are better ways to do things than, and this is how I think Americans traditionally did things prior to maybe 50 or 60 years ago, but we can't be stuck in a cultural practice that doesn't make sense.
We live longer. We are late bloomers now. I think that though, yes, I agree that in times past, younger was normal. Kids were like I said, taking care of their entire families by the time they were 16 years old. That was something that happened. Today, it just doesn't. So I don't think it has to do with religion or a change in morality. I just think it has to do with more than anything economic shift in society.
No, but
Okay,
it's
can
like
we
it's
talk
such a
about
depressing situation, like the economics, like people living today, they can't afford to live
there's just more of
alone.
us. There's more of us. There's like billion, my dad is 76 years old and I say that the population of the earth has like tripled since his birth.
Hmm.
I mean, that's incredible.
Yeah.
He's still alive. It's in his lifetime. The population of the earth has tripled.
Oh,
So
that's
there's just a
crazy.
lot of us. There's a lot of us. Can we talk about slavery?
Sure.
Okay, so if we go back to pre-enlightenment, then we're going back to slavery. What is your take on that?
So slavery is another one of these things that is universal. It's regulated and condoned in the Hebrew Bible and the Old Testament. It's something that's condoned in the New Testament as well. Christians and Jews have practiced it, Muslims have practiced it, and even outside of these faiths, you have other cultures that have universally practiced slavery. Now, why is that? Like slavery, to define it, is like owning another person, but really what it means is that you have the master has certain rights and the slave has certain rights. So in Islam, being a slave doesn't mean that you're like a piece of wood or like an object. Like you have certain rights, but your master also has certain rights, and you provide labor. But why it's universal is because of war. When you have this all universal aspect of human civilization, which is war. What do you do with the losing side? The losing side, if you just let them go, then they'll just regroup and attack you again. Or, do you kill them? You just kill them all. That would also be something that a lot of civilizations did when they won wars. They just wiped out the entire population. But another thing that you can do is to use that population as labor. And that way you have, there's an economic benefit that you get when you win a war. And what happens is that the societies that have more people, the civilizations that have more people, are going to be stronger and stronger because there is technologically primitive. The more people you have, the more likely it is that you can win future wars and you can defend yourself against invading tribes or invading civilizations. So the civilizations or the cities or states that had more people and had more slaves are more likely to win and prevent being wiped out and basically conquered and destroyed. So this is why it's universal. All the major civilizations, they had slaves, and it became like a moral necessity. If you did not have slaves, you were going to get wiped out, because if you just lose the war, or you win a war and you release people that you've conquered for no gain, then the people that do take slaves are going to get stronger and stronger, and then they're going to wipe you out and basically destroy your entire civilization. So it became a moral necessity and a moral need. And so think about it as a weapon of war, like slavery. That labor is a type of weapon of war. In the same way that today, you can't imagine a war that could take place without guns and bombs. Imagine
Right.
one side says that, well, guns are immoral, like bombs are immoral because you cause collateral damage, and this is a immoral way to do things. So we should just disregard all bombs, not use them. Any society that says that is immediately going to be wiped out, and so it's immoral to not use that weapon for the survival of your people or your race or religion. But you can imagine in the future, so there's some new technology, like some space laser technology, where you can precisely kill whoever you need to. And they'll say, like, oh, wow, can you imagine 100 years ago they were using bombs? Like, what backwards people. But,
Sure.
That would be a logical or a moral mistake, because you're not taking into effect the technological limitation. And slavery is in the same way. Like, for people to judge slavery as this, I'm not saying that all practices of slavery were good, because just like war is something universal, but you can have people who engage in barbarism, like the IDF, for example. They're engaging in a very barbaric, genocidal type of warfare. We can criticize that without saying that war in itself is something inherently immoral. War is something universal that every civilization has engaged in. And similarly, slavery, is a universal aspect of human civilization. There can be bad aspects of it that immoral actors engage in transatlantic slavery, and they're literally killing slaves or treating them in barbaric ways. So I in no way endorse any of that. But the institution of slavery is something universal, and it's not necessarily immoral. It's sometimes a moral necessity as a weapon of war, and is needed for survival. So that, in a nutshell, is the defense of slavery.
I understand historical, but are you saying today that's okay? That slavery is today is okay?
Well, Islam doesn't require slavery. Islam, the position is that slavery is just not immoral. The reason that slavery fell out of favor is because of the Industrial Revolution, and basically the steam engine made slaves obsolete, because an engine can do more than 100 men or 1,000 men. So you don't really need slaves. But if the steam engine, and actually I just had a conversation with Greg Magarshak, which I think you listened to, but in that conversation he brought up Islam and slavery. I pointed out that, well, this is in Judaism as well. But then I also pointed out that, okay, imagine that there's a huge solar flare and all the electronics, all the technology goes out the window, and we go back to a more primitive state of technology in the world. Slavery then would probably make a really big comeback, and it would be based on warfare. It would be based on all the things that I'm describing, but it's a technological aspect of history that when the industrialization happens, then you don't really, it doesn't really, you don't have slaves. Instead, you have employees. And one thing that some people point out, like Noam Chomsky, you might be familiar with, he said that historically there's not really a distinction between employee versus slave, because the idea of an employee, like your employer is paying you and then you use that money for food and shelter, that's basically what a master does with a slave. And the only difference is that as an employee, you're like rented by your employer, but a master owns you. So it's the difference between like renting a car and owning a car. And usually when you own a car, you treat it better than a rental. So this was actually the kind of argument that the South made in American history against the North, because they said that, well, yes, we have slavery, but in the North, you have these kinds of wage slaves, and you have these factories where people are working to themselves to death, whereas we treat our slaves very well because they're our property. We don't want to kill them. But with your employees in these northern factories in Boston and New York, when an employee dies, you just replace him with another body and pay him that $1 a day. Our slaves don't live in that kind of squalor. So
no, they were just whipped and sold, and their families broken up, and they didn't get to see their children anymore. I mean, there was,
employees would have to leave their countryside to go to the big cities to work in the
sure,
factories,
but they weren't sold off down the river. And I mean, I understand that the work conditions can be bad, but an employee would have a choice, ideally, to go and work somewhere else, and that makes an employer want to treat their employees really well. And I think for morality reasons, I mean, I guess I can understand the argument that there might be benefits. I can understand that there's benefits to things like slavery. I still think that they're highly immoral. Just like I could see a benefit to rape, for example. I can make an argument that rape at least creates biological diversity, right? When one tribe comes in and starts raping women in another tribe and they all get pregnant, now you've at least got, you don't have a bunch of inbreds like you would have normally if the tribes just stuck to each other and were having children with each other and they're all cousins, and then cousins having children with cousins, right? I mean, I could see it like a biological benefit to rape, but it doesn't mean suddenly rape is no longer immoral. It is still highly immoral and wrong to do, even if there is a benefit that can be argued from that act. Same thing with slavery. You can argue a benefit from slavery. I understand that there's economic benefit to it. It doesn't make the act any less immoral. I also understand that all the religions have it, that it is in all the books. I don't think this is unique to Islam, just like I don't think child marriage is unique to Islam. I think these are unfair attacks on Islam. When we see a lot of people lobbying these types of attacks, saying like, well, you believe in war, you believe in child marriage, you believe in slavery. And it's like, I think that's kind of in all the books, right? All of that is in all the books. I think the difference is that if you're Orthodox Islam, I don't know if there's any Orthodox Christians or Orthodox Jews that, Orthodox Jews, I guess. I had this experience of living with these ultra-Orthodox Jews at one point, don't ask. But they couldn't turn the lights on and off on Saturdays and stuff. And so I was the person that would turn the lights on and off. Like they let me commit all the sins, and they couldn't take so many steps on Saturdays. And there was a lot of restrictions there, but I still don't think they were so ultra Orthodox that they would believe in these types of things in the books that are societally, we have become enlightened out of those. Well, that's like slavery and rape and child marriages or whatever.
That's how the Enlightenment attacks every religion. Like the Enlightenment from the past 200 years, they specifically start with slavery and minor marriage, and they attack those things first, right, and get you to compromise on those. And that's why you have Christians who will say that, oh, well, the Bible doesn't really say this, or, oh, that was fine for the past days, but it's not fine now. Or minor marriage, yeah, that's something from the past. It's not relevant today. And then the secular, that's the first domino, basically. And then the secular,
but that's true.
If you're going to have a problem, like if you're going to amend this issue of slavery, even though it's clear in the Bible, then why don't you change your position on homosexuality? Like, why don't you change your position on theft? Like, why don't you change your position on fornication? Like, those are also in the Bible, or the 10 Commandments. Why aren't we in different times? and therefore you have different rules. You're willing to bend things for and amend things when it came to slavery. So yeah, just apply the same principle, and that's how they get you to completely reform your entire religion and essentially abandon your religion, because you lose the principle of saying, no, we follow our traditions, we follow our scriptures. Because you've compromised and you've taken that first step, then why not take every other step? And that's why, the religion that's bleeding the most followers is Christianity in the world today.
I would argue that if you go back to the prophets, the times of the prophets, and when the prophets were giving their revelations from God, society was a certain way that God had to give his guidance and his wisdom to those societies as those societies were. If we had a prophet today that came to society today, I think that the rules and the guidance and the wisdom would be for today's time versus for the Stone Age time. I mean, I think that when God saw society and he was like, oh boy, you fools, like, let me give you some guidance. He's not going to change all of society and rewrite how they've been living and rewrite, all of their customs. He's instead going to give guidance and wisdom in that helps with the current culture and the current way of life that they're in to, like, for example, polygamy. Mormons get eviscerated for having polygamy at one point. Well, that was guidance that Mormons believe came from prophets. Prophets at that time said it's okay to take more than one wife. The reasoning, though, later when prophets then, because Mormons believe in modern day prophets, later when prophets said, okay, now you have to stop this practice, it was because at that time, when they allowed all the men to marry more than one woman, it was because there were more women converting to the church than there were men, 10-1. I mean, there was just a lot of women. And that was in an era where women could not work. Women could not have bank accounts. Women could not support themselves. So these women were joining the church, but then they weren't having a way to be provided for. So God then, knowing that society at that time in the 1800s, said, all right, then you can go ahead and take more than one wife. Later on, when things changed, God said, no longer, you don't need to do that anymore. Things can change because that was a morality thing that, if you believe in all of this, which I personally no longer do, but I'm just kind of giving an example that, if God sees society and says, we have a problem, this is the moral way to handle the problem. But now that problem is gone. We don't have a need to handle this problem in the most moral way. So I do think things can change based on society and based on, it's what God felt like the guidance needed to be at that time.
Well, maybe, we're in a time now where you can have transgender children. You can have 3-year-olds on hormone blockers, and you can have,
well, if God says, what are you going to do? I mean, if there's a prophet that comes down today and it is truly a prophet of God and he says, yeah, it's fine. I mean, what are you going to do?
No, but the point is that you can justify anything, like using this reasoning. You say every principle that we have, every religious principle that we have in the past is something for the past, and now we're in a different time. So that principle no longer stands. Even like Satan worship, like maybe the idea of Satan is just a boogeyman that God had to tell us there's a boogeyman and to get us to act correctly. But Satan really is just a concept. And now we know that in our times, and we can even worship Satan. And maybe there's a prophet who's going to come and tell us that Satan worship is fine, and having child transgender drag queen story hour is fine.
I mean, Daniel, you are straw manning. You're straw manning big time. Come on. Yeah, devil worship.
Yeah, why
now we're
not?
going from God to devil.
Because the principle of devil worship being wrong, that's a principle that could have been for previous times, but now we're different psychologically, socially, things are very different.
I don't think God
using the same reasoning that you use.
That's not at all the same reasoning, because that would be belief in a completely different, if you're going to believe in God, God's not going to come down and say suddenly you can believe in somebody else and go ahead and worship them. I mean,
even the idea of God, like even the principle that there is a transcendent God, even that principle can be attacked, because you can say that, well, in previous time, people were so stupid and low IQ that you had to give them the idea of a God.
I believe
this
that.
Is what Jordan Peterson
I actually
says.
do believe
Jordan
that.
Peterson,
I believe that.
That's what,
I believe that. Yeah. I believe that people needed like simple. I think that our brains cannot comprehend, just like going back to the very beginning of this conversation, the ability to empirically study certain concepts that are so beyond us. We don't even have the mechanisms we can't even imagine the mechanisms to empirically study these things at this point, because our brains are so small. It's like trying to teach calculus to a 2-year-old. we're not there yet. We're like the 2-year-old. The truth out there is like calculus. I do think that we need simple, when a 2-year-old or 3-year-old asks me, how do you turn on the TV? How does the TV turn on? I just say, press the button. I don't go into all the mechanisms of how a television works and how we end up with a picture on the screen, right? We don't describe that. We just say, push the button and the TV turns on. And I think that is how humans, we've
I
needed
agree.
simple explanations.
I agree that God is beyond, what our minds can conceive. And we know certain aspects or characteristics of God, but to fully understand God is beyond our capabilities. I agree with that. But now you have people like Jordan Peterson will say like, well, maybe God is just, whatever value that you have as your highest value. And that is a very postmodern type of understanding of God that Christians would have historically rejected and say, this is not God. God is this, the Trinity, or God is this, like a transcendent being, and he's one, and he speaks, and he, sends revelation. It's not just whatever you think of as your favorite idea or ideal. But Jordan Peterson could respond to those Christians, and he can say that, look, the idea of God as this being who speaks, that's because people in the past were just simple-minded. But now we know that actually God can be your highest ideal. So this is
Well, I don't
this is a
necessarily, I
destruction of
agree, and I just,
Christianity.
yeah, I agree with him on the first half. I don't agree with him on the second half, because I think truth is truth, and it would have to be empirically, scientifically, the ability to study it and prove it at some point, whether we can in our lifetime or not, is that has nothing to do with whether or not something is true or real. So, yeah, I don't think that we could just kind of like, whatever we think is what it is. But maybe that would be an interesting, I suppose if we're going to get real philosophical, Daniel, which we could, I guess you could think that, well, maybe there is a reality where you can think it and it manifests, and that is what it is. But I don't know. But probably not. I don't know. Maybe. Daniel,
But yeah.
This has been an interesting conversation. We could talk forever. I now know why some of your debates are like 4 hours long, why your conversations are so long. We can go on about this stuff for a long time, and you're very interesting and fascinating, and I appreciate this conversation.
Can I say just one more thing, just
Yes, of
to
course.
circle back on the point that you're asking, like, what kind of Muslim are you? And yeah, so I want to distinguish like ISIS, like the idea that Islam advocates terrorism or just killing innocent people. Like, this is contrary to Islam. Terrorism is something that I reject, and I've taught against it, spoken against it. And it's not a part of Islam. Like the most hardcore, like I think the audience kind of gets a sense that I don't really compromise on much when it comes to Islamic teachings. If there was this kind of terroristic teaching in Islam, I would be very forthright, and I'd try to give some
But there
explanation.
is jihad, right?
There is jihad, but jihad is like there's defensive jihad, and then there's conquest. And conquest is, again, a part of every religion, and it's a part of every philosophy and ideology. Like you were talking about American values being spread and preserving, like Americanism throughout the world, and the U.S. uses whether by hook or by crook or by carrot and the stick. America gets its way in the world and influences different factions, and sometimes the military is needed to be sent. What is the driving force of that is to spread American influence. And Islam has the same concept, like spread Islamic influence to serve the needs of God, or the interests of Muslims, and to serve the higher aims of God. Like that is a part of Islamic law, and Muslims should be very honest about that. You had a different guest on the program, Hamza Yusuf, and I criticized what he was saying. He was like, there's nothing holy about war. And I completely disagree about that. Like war and fighting for the truth, fighting for what's right, even at the cost of your own body. Like this is a very important value in Islam. It's not terrorism. It's justified military conquest through a state, through a government. And this is a value that many religions share, all religions. And it's only in the modern period where religions try to, do this Hamza Yusuf move of denying that you have militarism and conquest in your religions. It's found in Judaism and Christianity. This is why Christianity is spread throughout the world. So this is just wanted to clarify that, because there's confusion. Yes, jihad is a part of Islam, but terrorism is not jihad.
And I also want to bring up something that you'd said in a previous conversation about rape on the battlefield. We've had a lot of reports about rape on October 7th, that all of these Palestinians, Hamas, they broke out and they used rape as a weapon. And I heard you say on a previous show that rape on the battlefield is not something that is actually in the Quran or in Islam.
No, there's no such thing as rape on the battlefield. I was making a distinction between the rules of war in Judaism versus Islam. Because when you go to the Talmud and you go to the authoritative rabbinical texts like the Mishnah Torah from Maimonides, there is this kind of provision for Jewish soldiers that they can rape on the battlefield, even girls as young as 3. And this is elaborated on. And even the modern rabbis in the IDF, the chief rabbi of the IDF has said that, yeah, rape is licit. You can rape as an IDF soldier. And we see, that actually happening. But in Islam, there's no such concept. There is the concept of a concubine. So again, going back to the slavery point, so slavery, women were also taken as slaves, but it was not just a one-time use them and kill them scenario. The concubine is part of the family. It's like a marriage in the sense that the concubine has rights. She's protected. She's provided for. And when she has a child, then she's freed. Those are the Islamic rules. It's a lot of details. It sounds strange if I'm just giving like a sentence or two about it, but this is something that's universally practiced, like taking concubines, because again, it's a weapon of war. You have to increase the numbers of your civilization in order to prevent being wiped out. That's why you have concubines mentioned, like Moses is telling his soldiers in the Hebrew Bible in Numbers and 1 Samuel and Deuteronomy to take the girls, the virgin girls. And that's what he's commanded in the Bible. This shows that this is something that is not specific to Islam.
Yep. Very interesting conversation, Daniel. Really appreciate you being here. Where can people find you? I'm going to put some links down below of some of the conversations that you've had, especially of some of the more controversial subjects that we've covered today. If they want to get more into your philosophy on these, or I shouldn't say your philosophy on these things, but on Islamic teaching of these things in the way that you personally interpret Islam, because that does, which I know is more orthodox to you. It seems like but I talked to 10 different Muslims and they're all saying the same thing, but you're all saying something different. So it's just like Christians, right? So Daniel, where can people find you? Where would you like people to find you?
Sure. I have a channel on YouTube. Hopefully it won't get taken down anytime soon, but it's
good luck.
Muslim Skeptic. I'm also on Rumble and on Twitter. You can find me as well. Just search my last name and muslimskeptic.com. And I just want to, say how much I appreciate, Kim, that you are willing to have this conversation, because a lot of people, they don't even want to broach these kinds of subjects, or they think it's very bizarre. And I know you don't agree with a lot of what I've said, but you can actually talk about it and, try to see things from a different perspective. I think that's a sign of really high intelligence, to be able to consider an idea or an argument without necessarily accepting it. But a lot of low IQ people, like, they don't even want to think about it. Like, it's offensive just to have the concept or the topic mentioned. So I really appreciate you for that. And I hope your audience enjoys it.
Well, thank you for saying that. Thank you so much, Daniel. We have all the links down below. Thank you again for this conversation.
Thank you.